So hi everybody, all attendees and also micha. My name is Ida Schyum and I am an art historian and the co-curator of the biennial LGBTQ together with Laboratory for Aesthetics and Ecology. And I'm really thankful to be introducing this workshop and micha cárdenas to you as a part of the program that I have curated for LGBTQ. LGBTQ is a biennial for artist-driven and self-organized exhibition platforms, usually taking place at Fabrikken for Kunst og Design in Copenhagen. Except this time, where the biennial, due to COVID-19, has taken on a digital format with launches of online works and events unfolding throughout this summer and early fall. And the title of this year's LGBTQ is Patterns in Resistance. The title Patterns in Resistance comes from the urge to understand the overlaps between the labor of the hand and digital technologies. And the first lines of the curatorial manifesto state, patterns are connections in the world. Patterns make meaning and carry forth identity, origin, and culture. Patterns are fabric and pixels, weaving and programming. Patterns can pass on traditions, recipes, prompts, and scripts between humans and machines across oceans and generations. And I think these four lines go hand in hand with theorist and artist micha cárdenas' texts and artworks so well that the biennial couldn't be without her. Although crafts and technology are often thought of as opposites, these interconnections, or they have interconnections between them, and Cárdenas consistently show this through her work as recipes for better futures. Cárdenas is a PhD and artist writing a new algorithm for gender, race, and technology. She's an assistant professor of art and design, games and playable media at the University of California, Santa Cruz. And her book in progress, Poetic Operations, Trends of Color Art in Digital Media, proposes an algorithmic analysis to develop a trend of color poetics. She's a first-generation Colombian American and a member of the artist collective Electronic Disturbance Theater 2.0. Her solo and collaborative artworks have been presented in various museums, galleries, and biennials. And likewise, she has published numerous books and articles, which I really recommend you all to read. Furthermore, I would also like to tell you that this is also the launch date of Cárdenas' game on the website of the biennial. The game is called Redshift and Portal Nettle and is an interactive story where we can space travel and experience migration through a trans woman of color's perspective. I recommend you all also to go and try that game after this workshop. And from these kinds of digital algorithms, Cárdenas also work with non-digital technologies by abstracting the concept of the algorithm to these recipes and rituals as well. Similar to a cooking recipe, her work, which she's going to talk about today, called Unstoppable, has this goal of creating a recipe of low-cost, bulletproof clothing for Black trans women, which is one of the most targeted groups among for homicide among LGBTQ people today. So therefore, I would like to welcome you, micha cárdenas, and who will at first introduce your work and thoughts, and thereafter we will do a brainstorming and workshop where we will brainstorm further on the work Unstoppable and how textiles can protect us further. And in the end, we will sum up and do a little discussion and do a Q&A and so on. So thank you and welcome, micha.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ida, and thanks so much everyone for coming. I'm really grateful. I'm really happy that this is still happening despite the pandemic. So yeah, it's really wonderful that we can still be here to do this. So I'd like to talk to you all about my work for maybe half the time, and then the other half we could have discussion and more workshopping. So I'm going to go ahead and start that. Okay. Does that work? You can see that? Great. Okay. Yeah, so thanks for that generous introduction. I appreciate it. So the talk I want to do today is about Unstoppable, but it does span a number of my other works, because I think that it makes the most sense if you see it through the whole process, and also through the framework that I've been thinking about it in my book. I do want to acknowledge the indigenous people of this land that I'm on, the Awaswas and Amamutsun people of the Ohlone Indian tribe. I think that it's a, it's a myth or falsehood that when we're meeting online, we're somehow disconnected from physical realities or physical spaces. So I think it's important to still acknowledge all the places that we are in. So yeah, the framework through which I'm thinking about this, it comes from my forthcoming book, Poetic Operations, Trends of Color, Poetics, and Digital Art. And so that book is coming out next year. And so, like Ida said, the book proposes an idea of algorithmic analysis. And so what I'm doing in that book is thinking about ways of extending intersectionality, of continuing the conversation started by Kimberly Crenshaw with intersectionality, but seeing how it could be extended through thinking about algorithms. And so 3 ways that I propose that we do that are by analyzing existing algorithms, making our own algorithms, or like making games, or making other recipes, and breaking down a problem into its basic operations. So the third one is what I'll focus on here. And so when I'm talking about algorithms, I am talking about code. I did study code and work as a software engineer, but I don't think that you have to understand code to understand algorithms. Algorithms are much older than code. They were invented in the 8th century by Muhammad ibn al-Khwarizmi. And the word algorithm is a Latinization of his name, al-Khwarizmi. So algorithms are basically a series of steps to accomplish a goal. And so I think that if we're familiar with recipes or even rituals, that we can think about those things in terms of algorithms. And so basically what I'm trying to argue in this book is that using algorithms can help us think differently, see differently when we're looking at digital art and new media art. And also when we're thinking about social problems like stopping violence against trans people of color. So in the book, I look at digital art by trans artists of color, and I try to articulate what I see as the trends of color poetics. And the way that I started articulating this was by thinking about the operations that I was using in my own fabric artworks, and in particular in making wearable electronics. I'll come back to that project in a minute. But so these 3 operations come from different kinds of actual fabric operations I was doing with my hands, with thread and with fabric and thread. But I tried to abstract them to think about how they could be operations of poetics that we see in lots of different artworks. And so the first one, the cut, is from Deleuze and Guattari and Derrida, and already articulated there, and then beautifully applied to new media art by Zelinska and Kember in their book Life After New Media. And then with shifting, so I'll come back to these. But shifting, I think about shifting in terms of changing one's location, but also one's color or one's appearance in different ways to create safety. And stitching, I think we can see in the physical act of sewing and stitching, but also that I think can be abstracted to other acts like connecting communities together or working towards solidarity. So when I'm thinking about textiles and resistance, I mean, immediately what comes to mind is resistance to what? And what do we mean by resistance? And so for me, resistance to colonization and to colonial forms of cisgender heteropatriarchy are a really central form of resistance that I'm interested in and engaged with. So one of the artists that the artist that I start my book with is Giuseppe Camposano. And Giuseppe is a travesti artist who is from Peru and has passed now. But Giuseppe created this project called the Museo Travesti de Peru. And so that's like it has been translated as the Transvestite Museum of Peru. And I think this is a really important example here. Think about how trans people broadly, trans people of color broadly, have for centuries used fabric and clothing for safety. And also for art and expression and poetics and performance. So this project was actually shown in Brussels. So it was started in Peru, but it's a conceptual museum. It doesn't have like a museum with a physical building. The gesture was to say, you know, what if we had a travesti museum of Peru, because travesti people are so looked down on in Peru that such a thing doesn't exist or would be impossible. So this is really important starting place for me because Camposano created these beautiful fabric pieces like this piece on the left that she used to do performances of the Virgin Mary. You see a sort of image of that performance up here. But also, I mean, it demonstrates to me all three of these operations. So we see cutting of fabric, we see stitching together fabrics, but also we see this act of shifting being really central, right? So Camposano sees the ability to change gender as like a superpower, or like as a sacred ability, as something special to travesti people. And so part of why I start with this is to get out of the Western US-centric ideas of transgender that imagine transgender means going from one sex or gender and traversing in a linear way to the other one and then having that endpoint there. Whereas I think that if we look at non-Western forms, non-US forms of gender nonconformity and gender variance, then that challenges and opens up the idea of what is gender? Why do we have this idea? Why not change genders every day? Wouldn't that be better? Or maybe that's better, or maybe not better, but that is another perfectly valid and important possibility. So Camposano creates this important decolonial lineage for me, where in this interview with Larry LaFontaine-Stokes, Camposano says we can trace a transvestite genealogy between the androgynous ritual Moshe and the Inca men disguised as women. The connection between the ritual androgyne and transvestite dancers as cultural mediators, and the hair from sacred indigenous and colonial offerings to the mode of subsistence for a modern transvestite hairdresser. And then ends with the transvestite as a revolution of pretenses of originality and unity determined by dominant history and ethics. Can you see my mouse cursor, Ida? Yeah, good, okay. So what I think that is that, you know, travestis give us such an important example of thinking about textiles or clothing or fabric as resistance to the everyday violence of transphobia, but also resistance to the, you know, centuries old colonial narratives that have attempted to stamp out any non-binary genders or any gender variants and to impose male and female gender binary with, of course, a patriarchy where men are always better. So that's a starting place for me. But then thinking about these operations individually, I think about cutting in terms of the way we cut fabric, right? But that operation can be much broader. So we could think about cutting in terms of interrupting flows of matter or fields of mediation. So Kember and Zelinska talk a lot about this, about the cut of digital photography, where you're, using a digital device to cut a moment in time and space. And they really encourage people to think beyond individual specific devices when thinking about new media. So instead of thinking about the iPhone in particular, to think about all the fields of mediation that enable the iPhone, that make it into this addictive device, that make it into this kind of communication. So, Wi-Fi networks, cellular networks, all of the internet protocols that make it so that something like an iPhone has all these capabilities and capacities. And then they offer that we could make ethical cuts into these fields of mediation. So in I can't see the slide preview. In this project that I mentioned earlier around wearable electronics, that was the initial impetus for this this thinking about these operations. And that really leads us to Unstoppable. So I was thinking about how to create safety through artwork. And I started making wearable electronic devices. So it's not super visible in this slide, but it will be in later slides. But I made this series of hoodies and bracelets that had wireless transmitters in them and LED lights in them. And what I was thinking about was, how do we have, I started reading about safety for trans women of color and women of color. And so I came across the Insight Women and Trans People of Color Against Violence Collective, and their book, Color of Violence, was so important for articulating an abolitionist politic and an abolitionist, prison abolitionist and police abolitionist safety strategies. Based on a very real practical reality that they described there, where often when women of color and trans people of color, queer and trans people of color, experience violence and then go and contact the police, then what we receive is more violence, not safety. So over time, many people have come to know that the police don't keep us safe. They're not there to keep us safe. Like Angela Davis has described so articulately the way that the prison is a gendering system, but also the prison is a site of sexual violence. So when women arrive to women prisons in the United States, they're immediately cavity searched. So they're basically have their bodies violated immediately. So as standard institutional practice, the first moment of a woman coming into a prison is a physical violation. So taking that thinking of how do we then build safety without prisons and police, I also wanted to think about how might we build safety without corporations. Because of the prison industrial complex, as Angela Davis has articulated, it shows us that the prison and the policing system is not just centered in prison and police, but it extends out through corporations and throughout society in many different ways. From things like private prisons and corporations like the Geo Corporation that own immigrant detention centers, to the corporations that use prison labor. And to all the other ways that corporations sell items to prisons, and there's many ways that the prison system is imbricated with corporations. So in thinking about how to build local safety networks that didn't rely on police and prisons or on iPhones, I started working on this line of clothing that had built-in wireless transmitters, so that you didn't need a cell phone or an internet connection at all. With these garments on that you see in this picture, you could you could basically press a button on your dress or hoodie and it would send out a wireless signal up to a mile range, and then they were mesh networked. So it would reach out to your local network, and if it reached another person with one of these local autonomy networks, or I call them autonets, if it reached another person with this autonets garment, that person would then multiply the signal. So I was using wearable electronics. I was using electronics sewn into these garments to build these local safety networks. So here's another one of those garments, modeled by a member of a collective that I was working with in Los Angeles. So as soon as I had built these prototypes of these garments, then I started doing workshops with them. I took them to community members. And I mean, this is a method of, community-based design or community-engaged art, but also, honestly, it's just like my own method. Like, I have ADHD. I'm not the kind of person that just like sits down and just like writes a grand masterpiece. I work basically in dialogue with people. That's how I work best. So I made these garments. Also, I was trying to avoid this kind of parachute model of art activism, where as an artist, I might just like drop into a community and be like, I have your answers to your problems. I think that that is not a method I want to use. How could that possibly work? So I took these garments to started working with a collective, Gender Justice LA, and they had been working for years with queer and trans people and low-income people in Los Angeles. So I was like, clearly that they know better about safety than me. They've been doing this for years. So we started doing workshops using Theater of the Oppressed, because they already had an ongoing Theater of the Oppressed group. And then out of that, we built performances out of those workshops. So then the physical act of stitching these garments was really more, for me, a method of facilitating the act of stitching solidarity, of stitching networks and relationships between people through a series of workshops over a number of years with Gender Justice LA. And another act of stitching that I write about in the book that actually kind of prefigures all of this stuff is, I said earlier that I was trying to think in this work about how to create safety through artwork. So I had come to that through working with the Electronic Disturbance Theater, which is an artist collective, including Ricardo Dominguez, Brett Stahlbaum, Amy Sarah Carroll, and Ellie Mermond. And we made this project called the Transborder Immigrant Tool, which is pictured here, which was a tool that really inspired a lot of the trajectory of my work. So we collaborated with local organizations in San Diego to build this tool that would help people find water in the US-Mexico border. So this is, again, a kind of abstracted way of thinking about stitching solidarity. Like, we, as this artist collective, collaborated with these activist groups that were putting these water caches in the desert already. And then we built an app that would use a GPS map to direct people to these water caches. And as they were going to the water, they had the option to hear poetry. And Amy Sarah Carroll wrote poems and I wrote poems. And she wrote a series of poems with desert survival information encoded as poems, like what kind of cactuses are drinkable versus what kind of cactuses are poisonous. And so this inspired me to think about a number of directions in my work. One was this idea of working towards safety, but another one was really using recycled objects. So we wanted to make these devices cheap and accessible, so we use these cheap, there's a Nokia phone pictured there, use these cheap phones off of eBay that were like $20 that still had GPSs. So I'm happy to come back to any of these projects in the Q&A. So this is another one of the AutoNet's garments. I wish I could see my preview. Oh well. This is another one of the AutoNet's garments that was a dress that I made. And this is like the most basic one of those local autonomy networks garments. So it's basically just a battery and a wireless mesh networking transmitter on a bracelet. And again, so I took these to workshops with people. So I did a workshop at the 01 Biennial in San Jose, again with Gender Justice LA and local community members. And then I got a lot of interesting, challenging feedback, you know. I mean, some of the feedback was that people didn't want to have GPS. People didn't want to, initially I was thinking about using GPS units. But immediately I got feedback from groups that I was working with that was like, we don't want GPS units. That's not safety to us. So I was working with a group in Bogota, Colombia, and they were like, even if you're encrypting the GPS data, the government surely has the ability to unencrypt it, and we don't want to be noticed. So they wanted to prevent disappearances, but they didn't want to use GPSs. So then I changed it to be just proximity detection. So it would only be able to detect like how close or far the other people in your network are. But what was most important to me about that project was building the connections between people and the local networks. And so another important feedback element that came up through this project was people saying, that's cool, you can build a $100 hoodie, but if I had $100, I would probably buy a smartphone and not a mesh network hoodie. And that issue of affordability was very real for me and for the communities that I was thinking about working with. So this is one of the images from a performance that we did in Sao Paulo, Brazil. And, you know, it was very clear that people in Bogota or Sao Paulo, a lot of people don't have smartphones there, and cannot afford them, and cannot afford wearable electronics. So there, we really focused on using the fabric electronic garments I had made as a beginning of a conversation, and using them as kind of like, you know, speculative future prototypes, but thinking like, okay, well, how could we build these local connections? Even if we don't have mesh networking, how could we communicate like, I need help with our friends? Maybe we could use phone trees or texting networks, or even how to communicate in a public space. So like, if we're out in public together, if we're like at a bar together and I need to leave because someone is making me feel unsafe, how do I communicate that to you without letting the guy sitting next to me know? So we talked about those and practiced those kinds of methods. And also thought about the feeling of safety. Because I realized definitely over time of doing this project and interviews about this project that a lot of what I was searching for in this project was to feel safe and to feel like I had a community. A lot of trans women of color experience isolation. And that is like that's a primary thing of being isolated from social networks, even from queer communities, even from queer women's communities, leads trans people to not have access to housing, not have access to jobs, not have access to safety in times of, you know, crisis and climate event and pandemic. So I think that the emotional aspect of this project became more and more important for me over time, and the performance is centered around like, what does safety feel like in your body? What does safety look like to you? Can you, so, and some people said, I don't know, I never feel safe. And so then it was like, okay, well, what could you imagine safety might feel like or look like? And I don't see the participants list now. Oh, I do see the participants list. Yes, Chingy is here, which is really exciting because Chingy is a brilliant poet, and they were in one of the Autodesk workshops where we did a gorgeous performance together in Milwaukee at the Dark Side of the Digital Conference. Maybe they want to chime in later about that. Okay, so thinking about these operations of the cut and the shift and the stitch brings us almost to unstoppable. So with shifting, I'm thinking about, you know, the way we fold or move fabric around to make different connections between it. But also thinking about all the ways that we shift our appearance for safety on a daily basis. So this might mean, I think lots of people do this. I mean, you know, in particular, I would think about femmes. I'm a femme. I think a lot about femme camouflage and femme magic and different like femme strategies for safety, and the way you might, you know, put on a different coat if you're going to a different place that might make you feel safer, or even the ways that we have to change our appearance to be in academia or to be in art circles to feel safe or accepted or acceptable. And Janelle Monáe's video, Many Moons, where she is this holographic character who can change her skin color, and was an early inspiration for thinking about shifting. But also other Black trans women's video games like My Nietzsche by Maddie Bryce is a big inspiration for me thinking about this. So I made my game Redshift thinking about a lot of these different ways that we change our appearance or change location for safety. I mean, you know, crossing a border is a way of shifting your body or position so that you can be in a safer place. And yeah, I'm really thrilled that this is in the show, Alt-CPH. I can share the link for it later, or if you Google Redshift and Portal Metal, it's online, or it's on the Alt-CPH's Instagram link, bio link thing. Okay, so all that brings us to Unstoppable. So let me show this short video about Unstoppable. I think I have like 15 more minutes. Yeah, so one of the main, hold on, let me open the window. Okay. So one of those pieces of feedback that came through local autonomy networks was really important to me, was the piece of them, people saying like, this is cool, but it's unaffordable, it's not accessible to me. And so in 2015, I wanted to think about a different project that was not wearable electronics, but was thinking about, you know, this was soon after the shooting of Trayvon Martin and Tamir Rice, and really thinking about how to actually stop the bullets. Because even if you have a safety network, like by the time you press a button and said, I need help, you're probably already really in a lot of danger. Yeah, so I wanted to think about how to use recycled materials to make free or very low cost bulletproof clothing. Let me make sure that I did the optimize for video thing. Optimize for video, share computer sound. Okay, so let me show this video about that project and then we'll talk about it more. Oh, the Unstoppable project is aimed at creating DIY bulletproof clothing and backpacks at low to no cost, and disseminating instructions about how to make them. The goal is to prevent the murders of Black trans women, who are the #1 target of murder among LGBTQ people in the US. Additionally, Black people, migrant people, and people in the global South are all under constant threat of gun violence. My initial research showed, come back, that multiple layers of tires could stop bullets, as well as Kevlar, which could be recovered cheaply from discarded cars in junkyards. So this is the initial round of testing that we tried to verify these claims with.
This stuff does have steel in it. I cannot shoot it if you want.
Okay. As long as the copper's on there to bounce off, it's going to be fine.
Okay. 9mm.
So this is Chris Head, who's an artist who I collaborated with over many years. He worked on Becoming Dragon, and he was at UCSD when I was there also. I'd never shot a gun before, and he knew plenty about guns and did art about guns, so I asked him to collaborate with me on this.
Ready? Hitting it.
The only pistol I have is an air gun.
Well, I think it went through all the layers right here. And then definitely right here. We can take them off just to be sure. But
At least 3 went straight through it.
Yeah.
But maybe only 3.
Yeah, this penetrated right here. There's 3. These 3 went through. This one at an angle, and then these 2 straight through.
These.
If you need to stop for any reason, okay. You're hitting it. Oh, you're definitely hitting it. Airbag. Go for it. Got it.
Right in the middle.
Yeah, you're gonna shoot the tire. Or no. It looks like it could be one of these because I see only one.
Sit over here at all. Do you?
This maybe?
That looks like it. Doesn't look like it at all. Well, I don't know.
It looks like something,
Yeah, maybe right there.
but it doesn't look like it went through. You want me to pull this apart? We can look.
Sure. Let's put it back together.
Really? Sure. Here's a bullet.
There's quite a few.
There are? Yep. Stopped it.
Oh.
Yeah. And it didn't deform or fragment. It hit the rubber. So.
Sitting on the ground, you can just feel it.
Yeah.
Okay. So let me just say a little bit more about that project and then we can have a discussion. I'm going to do this so I can see the slide previews. Oh, yeah. I mean, I also just want to mention about the incredible prevalence of murders by police in the United States. I mean, obviously now a lot of attention has been brought to George Floyd's murder, or Tony McDade, or Breonna Taylor, or Nina Pop, but over 700 people have been killed by police in the United States this year alone. And we don't even know most of their names. I mean, over 700 people is so many. It's overwhelming. So this project came out of a moment where I was at the LA Media Conference, and Patrisse Cullors, who's right here, is a friend of mine from Los Angeles, and as was Edxie, and who was a model in that video. And Patrisse had this line of t-shirts and hoodies that said bulletproof. And she approached me and she was like, I think this wearable electronics thing you're doing is really inspiring. Like, let's collaborate on our project together. And I had heard about Nea Bustamante's project Soldadera, which was to make period dresses of Mexican revolutionary women out of Kevlar. And I was familiar with earlier like armor projects like the Tute Bianche was a Italian social movement in like the late 90s to 2001, and the alter globalization movement, who responded to police violence by creating improvised armor, creating, you know, it's kind of funny to be like, oh, we're gonna go to this protests with like covered in noodles and inner tubes. But it was, you know, a very real effort to protect themselves from police violence. So out of that, I thought like, okay, well, why don't we make our own bulletproof? Well, maybe we could make the bulletproof clothes actually bulletproof. So I started researching do-it-yourself methods for bulletproofing, and immediately came across a lot of white supremacist websites with all of the details about what caliber of bullet is stopped by what kind of material. Because what's happening in the US now, which seems like on the verge of race war, or, you know, actual murders of people at protests, right-wing people and left-wing people, is something that white supremacists have been planning and stoking and preparing for in the United States for years. So in 2015, I Googled DIY bulletproofing. First thing that comes up on Google is a whole list of white supremacist forums. And so they talked about how you could get Kevlar, which is that bulletproof fabric, for free from junkyards because it's in airbags. So I did. I went to some junkyards in LA and I cut some airbags out of them and made this simple tube dress, just draping the fabric around Edxie. And also was thinking about bulletproof backpacks. So some tires have metal in them. What's that called? Radial metal belting. I forget the word for it. But also some tires are made with Kevlar and can stop bullets. So I made this prototype of, you know, if you could put a bunch of sheets of tire in a backpack, it might prevent you from getting shot in the back. But of course, as I said in the video, like no guarantees this is our project. And then we went out and tested it and found that we could stop 9mm bullets with tires. But the Kevlar sheets that we were using were not able to stop any bullets. I've since read that you need 8 sheets of Kevlar, and I didn't have 8 sheets because I didn't find that much. But I think this is a possible avenue for continuation of this project, is to, number one, figure out how to identify which airbags are really Kevlar, because I never could really identify that. I mean, I could look at it and say, this looks like ballistic fabric, but I wasn't 100% sure. And also to see how we can get Kevlar to actually stop bullets. I've seen some other videos about certain kinds of plastic cutting boards stopping bullets on YouTube, but I was not able to reproduce that. So yeah, I'm interested in what kind of ideas you all have for similar projects, but I'll come back to that at the end. The one last thing that I want to mention in the last few minutes is this recent project that I've just released on the App Store, the Apple App Store. It's called Scene Soul. Because what I just wanted to mention a bit was thinking about virtual costume design, virtual clothing design, and you know, textiles, virtual textiles. My current grad student, Patrick Stefaniak, is on Instagram, and he's doing really exciting work thinking critically about virtual fabric in video games. But I think a lot of game design, if it includes characters, also includes costume design. And with this project, I'm thinking about climate change and how climate change is disproportionately affecting trans women and trans people and disabled people, chronically ill people, people of color. And so I made an augmented reality game where this kind of hologram character, Aura, comes and talks to you. Well, actually, you walk in real physical space with your iPad or iPhone, and you can encounter her, and then she tells you poems and stories about experiencing wildfires. I mean, when I wrote about this, it's because I was in Seattle and the wildfire smoke from BC was blanketing the city, and it was a very intense experience. since then, just last week or 2 weeks ago, I actually had to evacuate my home in Santa Cruz because of the wildfires were just a couple miles from my home. So it's not so speculative for me anymore. It's different. But I wanted to think about how to establish this character in different ways. So I worked with a character design artist named Morgan Thomas, who's super brilliant and amazing. And, you know, I wrote the poems in the series, and I gave Morgan the poems and the idea of like, let's build an AI who is a trans Latina woman, or let's build an AI who rebels against her gender programming, and an AI who's not white. And as usual, me thinking about femme aesthetics, I thought, okay, well, if this is a AI that's meant to be a friendly navigational guide, then she should look, you know, more like she's wearing a party dress than like she's running from a wildfire. So we decided, together, Morgan and I came up with this design for this dress. And so that happened by me, like I said, giving Morgan the description and the poems. And also I made a mood board of like inspirational fashion ideas. And then Morgan came back with some designs and drawings like these. And then we iterated back and forth. You know, I was like a little more of this, a little less of that. Let's go in this direction. And then Morgan came up with this, or maybe these two designs at the same time. And I asked for another round of designs from Morgan where I was like, I really like this, but I feel like the hollow arm is distracting in this case. And, you know, maybe like the hair from another character, this one we could use. So then Morgan came up with this drawing, which is what we then turned into that 3D model in the game. So this sort of impossible dress that has like particle generators coming out of the bottom and top of it. Yeah, I thought that was pretty exciting. I mean, there's a lot of kind of intense issues I'm thinking about in the game around climate change and wildfires and extinction being a multi-species event, and how much longer will we choose all of these cultural things that we are doing bringing us to extinction. And, you know, hopefully one of the things that we can do is think more about recycled materials in everything that we do, including artwork. Yeah, so I kind of wanted to take like a 3-minute break, but we could go into discussion. So I'll stop the share. I was thinking about, should we take a break, or should we put people, or do people want to do breakout rooms?
I think maybe it will be already a break when I have to make all the attendees into panelists.
Okay.
So because I had to like push the buttons.
Okay, great.
Timed. Will that be okay break?
Sure, 2-minute break. I'll be right back.
Yeah. So now I try to add all of your videos and so that we can do a real workshop. Also, I will unmute you when you feel like talking. So we'll start just as soon as Micha gets back.
Great. Hi, everyone. Nice to see everyone.
So, Micha, should we start brainstorming further on Unstoppable, or do you feel like a discussion first? Or?
Sure. I mean, it's weird having how to do a workshop on Zoom. I mean, I have questions for you all, and I'm also to have. So maybe we want to. I don't know if we want to take a moment to think about those questions, or you have questions for me about the talk. I mean, when I think about Unstoppable and how to expand that, you know, I think about. I mean, things I did in that project were to identify local organizations and activists that I could work with. I felt like I didn't want to do a solidarity project with Black people on my own. So I'm interested to hear, like, what is Black Lives Matter doing in your town? Or what are some organizations in your town that you might be able to collaborate with or be interested in doing solidarity work? And then, or also, are there ideas about how to use fabric and textiles for activism, for resistance? Yeah. Maybe people could introduce themselves. You're muted, Ida.
I can introduce myself.
Thanks.
My name is Miriam. My pronouns are she and her. I am one of the curators behind Alt-CPH, and I'm really happy to be here. Thank you, Ida, for co-curating this, and thank you, Micha, for being here. Well, maybe should we just do an introduction first and then we can talk after, or should I just say something about solidarity work straight away?
Let's do intros.
Yeah, good. Okay, then that's it for me. Thanks.
Should I call on people, or you wanted to call on yourselves? Oh, Anne, did you have your hand up?
I'm just sewing.
Oh, great.
I'm working with embroidery for my dissertation, and I'm in Denmark, in Odense, but I work in Aalborg, which is quite far from here. And I'm here because I'm doing a project that's interdisciplinary, and I'm working with both cultural studies, literary analysis, and then arts-based research. So that's why I wanted to see your talk. And
Great, thank you. Does anybody else want to introduce themselves?
Okay, I can do. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Good. I'm Åse Jørgensen, and that's a terrible name in an international community. So, but anyway, I'm graphic designer of the Alt-CPH, and involved in that way. And then I just, yeah, maybe I'm mostly curious, so I wanted to participate.
Great. Thanks.
Oh, hello. My name is Lena Håkansson and I live in Sweden. I teach design at my local university in Växjö, and I'm very interested in textile and sustainability in a wide way, but also I'm interested in how craft can be used in contemporary settings, because I think today the university becomes more and more theoretical. So I'm interested in the practice-based part, you can say.
Great.
I can go. So my name is Cordelia. My pronouns are she, her. I am assuming from Chicago. I am a PhD student in performance studies at Northwestern, and my project's actually on textiles as a medium for protest. So, and this comes from years of working in a collective called the Embroidering for Peace initiative, and yeah, I have many thoughts about how these things can be used. It has been hard to just to prioritize many years of work, of textile work, of to really to compact it into written form. But I'm just fascinated by it. And Micha, I know about your work since before I came here, and I was very struck by a performance with thread, with the thread that I got nervous, but that lights up. So I think that something like that becomes activated in the practice, and I'm here. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, I did a couple of those. One of the first AutoNets performances was in LA, and it was with that, I can't even remember the name of it, Pandemic Brain, whatever, luminescent wire, EL wire, yes, electroluminescent wire. I found that it's very bad for dancing in, and it breaks easily.
Even when
I can introduce myself. Oh, sorry.
Oh, yes, Albira, please.
Yeah, so I am in Virginia. I just saw your tweet about the talk. I was very excited. Yeah, I teach here, and I'm writing on Unstoppable for one of the chapters in my book. So I actually was going to approach you about permissions soon.
Wonderful.
Yeah, it's like, oh, this is a super cool opportunity to get to see your talk. And yes, I will write I look at race and religion, gender, sexuality in terms of clothing. I look at the hijab and turban, and specifically in relation to opacity and what opacity, how we can theorize around it in terms of textiles. And so I look at contemporary art projects as well as sort of a way of thinking about resistance. So that's where Unstoppable and some of the other projects sort of are really sort of helpful and resonant. Yeah, so that's what I'm working on right now. But yeah, thank you for this really wonderful talk. Appreciate it.
Yeah, great. Those are really interesting questions. Thank you. Okay, so do y'all want to talk about my questions, or do you have questions for me? My questions were about what is are there local campaigns that you are interested in working with or sharing about or thinking about? Or maybe ideas about how to use textiles for solidarity with Black Lives Matter campaigns. I did look up Black Lives Matter Denmark, which is working on this immigrant detention center prison they want shut down. Which I don't even know how to say, which looks like Elbake prison.
Tillsmark. Is that it?
Yeah.
Oh, great. Okay. Yeah. But I don't know if that's anywhere near you, or if those campaigns are anywhere near you, or what.
Denmark is very small, so everything is very near. But yes, what I'm wearing right now is Support Black Trans Lives, which was a campaign. Some of the groups organized around the departure center, the immigrant services. They call it the departure center, but it's more like a jail where people that are rejected from asylum they can go to. And that's especially, I think, in Denmark. That's a place where BIPOC trans lives are the most how can you say it, threatened. That's in those asylum centers. Because of that, Denmark doesn't really accept people fleeing in order to get asylum for LGBTQA reasons. And this was like a hoodie in response to that in order to help those kind of people. So that's kind of like one textile, which is like a really typical way of kind of like supporting those kind of groups. But I think that's like one of the most like local urgencies related to this in Denmark.
Mm-hmm. Good. Yeah, I put a link about that BLM Denmark there in the chat. Yeah, thanks for sharing about that. Yeah, I mean, like I said, a lot of my earlier work was around borders and you know, feeling that urgency, being in San Diego, just like very close to the border, and thinking about what could we actually do to try to intervene in a way that's like, you know, to try to maybe go beyond a representational way. I don't know that we succeeded in doing that, but we did make that prototype of the transport immigrant tool. Yeah, I mean, detention centers is such a huge issue in the US. I mean, sadly, it seems like they've gotten a lot less attention from activists, but I mean, the Never Again campaign has done some awesome work at detention centers, trying to bring attention to it, try to get people out of detention centers. I mean, there's tens of thousands of people in detention centers, and a lot of them are like literally in cages in the US right now. So yeah, did you want to, I don't know, say more about, Cordelia, about that activist work against transnational organized crime?
Well, I mean, I could say a bit, and then, I think that it's also very interesting to say. I was just writing a bit about Monterey as a city of refugees, so maybe I can say a little bit about that. And I don't work on migration, so I partnered with Victoria Rios, who's a local activist scholar in Monterrey. So we were just sort of looking at how COVID also, she works on trans migrants, trans and queer migrants. That's her thesis. So for this specific piece, it was more informative as to like the history of detentions, when they started, how the flow of like acquiring refugee status, like how the applications for refugee status increased. And so basically a lot of what happens not only in the border once people cross the border, but before they cross the border is like an obstacle course where people are maimed, and where a lot of things, like a lot of the organizations and the police corps that are there are the biggest obstacles. And that's from, and I've talked to people from the South, and also, and it just follows the road of the train. So that's one thing. And with COVID, a lot of people are starting to flow back, but the flow forward to the border of the United States is still very active. So one of the bigger threats that has always been there, but has just exponentially increased, is kidnapping, bad organized crime, and being submitted to forced labor. And this, of course, happens with being in cahoots with the state. So it's a big network of forces that affect the migrant path, which has always been there, but is now very much. That's why the caravans came in huge volumes, because there needed to be like huge protection. That's what I'm thinking also with the recent conversation. That's why there was huge protection. And also I've seen the network of migrant shelters grow, and so many of them with COVID have shut down. So this is something about migration, but my work has been mainly with relatives of people who have relatives of people who have been forcefully disappeared. So it's about, and we started it. There's been several things, but like the main involvement with textiles has been the Embroidering for Peace initiative, which made this small group of people in my hometown of Monterrey, which is very much like an industrial city, gather together to protest violence, embroidering white handkerchiefs. I have some, I mean, no, I have stuff that it doesn't resemble it very much, but I can share stuff with you, like just handkerchiefs, and they hang on a clothing thread. So it all began with embroidering the names of their sons, and these handkerchiefs, I mean, this is a big initiative. So there's many groups in Mexico that have embroidered, and people who still communicate via this, and femicides are embroidered, other hate crimes as well. And this started as a networking activity, and something that allowed, this is what I'm researching, that allowed the people who were very much destroyed in many ways and destroyed in their capacity to network as well, to reweave this bonds and to find ways to perform searches, like actual searches in like clandestine graves. So that's sort of like one of the trajectories that I am taking, and the embroidery, it connected them to so many other people and allowed the occupation of public space, because it was also done in public space, and it allowed like a very quiet staying with the uncertainty, because at least when it started, when the embroidery activity started in 2012, there were so many massacres, and there was so much fear and so little knowledge that it allowed them also that it allowed us to sit with not knowing, especially not knowing whether a space was safe or not, and just cope with a lot of fear and threats. And that did not stop in 2012. So it's how the embroidering activity itself translated itself, it provided like a groundwork for acquiring other types of knowledge and dealing with uncertainty, and also learning how to protect ourselves. So, I mean, this is like I wanted to incorporate a bit of that, because I think that it'll be good for the conversation, but I can be in contact with anyone who wants to know more, and I am going to be sharing links in the chat so you can see what I'm talking about.
Great, thank you. That's really so important. I think especially what you were saying there at the end about just like finding methods or techniques to help us just stay with the uncertainty, or Don Haraway writes about staying with the trouble. I mean, I feel like I'm doing a lot of that these days. That was a lot of what Scene Soul was about, that game about wildfires, is to try to get people to just like face the reality of climate change instead of just feeling like it's overwhelming and turning away from it.
Yeah, I think that it communicate, people were turning away from the situation and seeing something embroidered that would, like the name of someone and just detailing the disappearance and the massacres, made people want to engage more. Even just seeing them on the web, it shifted a little bit, and people started to engage. And people who embroidered cases, that's a different story, but it was also a way of engaging when you didn't know how to, or when you didn't know where to start, because everything seemed overwhelming too.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd love to just sort of ask a question about, I mean, one, I just want to express that I love the organization of your project, like the cut, the shift, the stitch. I mean, I'm very excited for the book. And just seeing how you're thinking about things in such a way where, you know, you're thinking about like the sort of question of safety in a really like, a very like practical way, which is so like helpful in so many ways, because like, for me, that's not like necessarily how my mind works. And so seeing that you're taking one, obviously like having a design background and being able to like do all of that work is very like amazing. But like taking the sort of sense of like feeling like that existential threat to your safety as like a vulnerable person or a community, right? And taking that and creating these garments that do have this sort of really practical value, but also function as art and as in terms of like wearable technologies. And for me, I've used Unstoppable in the classroom for a unit I do on the hoodie, and sort of thinking about BLM in terms of like racialization, obviously like all of the ways that that's racialized and gendered in this in a very specific way. But a lot of my students ended up having this question about the line itself in terms of affordability. And so it's something that I think, you mentioned, and I'd love to just hear a little bit more about what it means to sort of think about this in terms of like the art world and markets and the practical question of like affordability, because these kinds of projects, like I'm also thinking of like Adam Harvey's work, the line stealthwear, right? The sort of like the clothing that's supposed to protect you from like drone strikes by using the thermal signature. So just thinking about like how that's like the cost of that is crazy, but like $100, right, is sort of like obviously out of reach for the people who need it, right? So I'd love to just hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks so much. Yeah, I think Adam Harvey's work is a really, really great and interesting example. He also worked with, oh gosh, I forget their name. He also collaborated with this collective of women of color to make this scarf, this like anti-facial recognition.
Hyphen Labs.
Hyphen
They're
Labs,
called
yeah.
Hyphen Labs.
Yeah.
Yes, awesome, yeah. Yeah, that's such a good example. But yeah, I mean, I had that same concern about stealthwear when I saw it. I was like, that's cool that you made a hijab that will make you not be seen by drones, but it's like thousands of dollars. So yeah, I mean, that's part of why I made such a big, that's part of why I like really changed direction with AutoNets and, kind of put it aside to try to do the Unstoppable project instead. But I think it was like through working on Unstoppable and trying to come up with free bulletproof solutions that I realized that the emotional aspect was more important to me. I mean, it was like, what's funny was that once I had this prototype of Unstoppable that was free, then some interviewer asked me like, well, okay, free is good, but like, what if you had all the money in the world? And I was like, okay, well, that's stupid. I mean, I don't, and no, the communities I'm working with don't have all the money in the world. But it did make me think about how the emotional healing and the feeling of safety was what I was really going for. So I shifted that work a lot. But I mean, a lot of this work did come out of like very practical concerns of my own safety, living in LA, and like when I was working on AutoNets and the hoodies, the network hoodies and performances, I did a residency in Berlin and Lüneburg, with this media lab there, and I had a really terrible experience. I was like constantly getting harassed. I like actually got hit on the street by someone in Berlin, and so my work really shifted there to be like, we started to develop, it came out of this everyday experience of my friends having to literally get in between me and other people. So we made like a choreography out of that. That was like, okay, we'll go on the train and wherever I'm standing, like you'll be in between me and other people all the time. So yeah, I mean, I guess I was trying to balance I don't know, balance the like practical need with trying to do something expressive. And as far as like art market and stuff, I feel like really like an outsider artist. I mean, I guess that's a silly thing to say at like a biennial event. But as a media artist and so many other ways, like I don't sell expensive things. And a lot of museums and galleries don't even know how to deal with anything technological. So like while I've been working on Scene Seoul, pretty much every museum or gallery I talk to is like, oh my God, an iPad? We needed to show it on an iPad? Can you provide the iPad? I'm just like, are you serious? It's 2020. Like, don't you use iPads all the time? And they're like, okay, you can have an iPad, but it has to be chained to the wall. And I'm like, well, people have to walk through the museum with it, so that doesn't really work. So anyway, there's lots of technical challenges with media art and official art venues. To show Scene Seoul mostly, I've like literally shipped a bunch of iPads to museums and been like, well, I hope I get them back. If I don't, that's fine. Yeah.
But it's so nice that you can now download it yourself, like, so that everyone can get it on their own device if they have one. I like that too.
Yeah, I'm so happy about that. It was just a few weeks ago, or maybe a month ago, that I got it up on the App Store. It's felt to me like an insurmountable thing until it was done. Because it's at Apple's whim, you know? So I was like, I don't know if it'll get approved or whatever. But yeah, now anybody can try it.
In addition to Bernbia's question, I also wanted to ask, like, because it's like a little bit in a prolongation of that, like how you place yourself on the spectrum with like Adam Harvey and Zach Glass, who really work with like this kind of like opacity and visibility and textiles and so on. But your work again like seems so post-digital and so cheap materials that it wants to give even more out there than just being speculative design. Like, because, you know, like Hyphen Labs and Harvey, they talk about their own work as speculative design, as something that is not really supposed to be out there, but just expand our imaginations in a way. So like, it seems like that you want a little bit more to be out there with the works. Like, could you elaborate a little bit on that? Like, talk a little bit about that. How you see the functionality in the works.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I think there's like a few different levels to that. Like, I don't know. I mean, with my work, you know, I'm really inspired by people like Colectivos Situaciones, who are trying to like not write theory about social movements, but like work with movements. So with my work, I'm not just trying to like theoretically make a burqa for someone who I've never talked to. I'm trying to like actually engage with communities and like see what might help, or, you know, see what I could do as an artist. And then take that feedback. So, you know, when I made all those hoodies, it was like 2011, and took it to a workshop with a bunch of queer and trans youth of color. And they were like, this is cool, but what I'm really suffering from is like all of these other kinds of violence. And so I like, you know, I listened and changed that project and tried to do something different. Or like when I took it to Brazil, they were like, this is too expensive. I was like, okay, well, we'll just put them on the side and focus on like, how do we do nonverbal communication in public space? And like, how do we actually keep each other safe? Like, let's have a conversation about, if I get assaulted, can I call you? Because a lot of people have never had those conversations. And that's why we end up relying on police and prisons, because who else are you going to call? If you haven't had an agreement with your community members, or if you don't even have a community, if you haven't had an agreement with like people close to you about what to do when something terrible happens, then you end up relying on some government structure. So yeah, I think that part of trying to be engaged with communities makes me in a way like out there more than trying to like make a product or something that is like broadly appealing. But I guess the other thing is like, I try to think about my work in a framework of decolonization. And I think that is, I mean, it can be part of sci-fi, but it seems like maybe something alongside sci-fi or separate from, or a different framework, you know, like Belita and Marisha in Octavia's Brood talks about visionary fiction and like trying to create fiction that works with political issues. But I just think that having a decolonization as a framework, then like apocalypse is not something that just happened when COVID hit or is about to happen next year or whatever. Apocalypse happened in 1492 already, hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And we're like way after the apocalypse. We are the apocalypse. And so I guess that kind of maybe provides a different framework that seems out there from some other people working in the sci-fi way, yeah. But also there was the real practical reality in terms of like trying to be post-digital. I was more thinking about trying to be post-internet with AutoNets, because it was so apparent with Snowden and the NSA in the United States, the National Security Agency, that they were tracking people at the DNS level. So like at the fundamental protocol level, it's built in that every packet of information has the address of like who it's coming from and who it's going to. So it's like designed from surveillance from the ground up. It's a military technology. So with local autonomy networks and the hoodies and bracelets, you know, I was like, okay, well, that internet thing's not gonna work. How do we build our own internet? How do we build our own networks? Yeah. But I do think see myself in dialogue with those other artists. I mean, Zach's like a good friend of mine and we've collaborated a few times. I wrote about both of them in that chapter. Yeah.
So we have 5 minutes left. I was thinking whether some of you have any more questions for Misha, or you have any more responses on the questions on how to work with textiles as resistance in your local communities. And thank you very much, Cordelia, for your sharing all the links. It looks really interesting.
Yeah, if you want to share anything you're working on or questions about engaging with community groups or questions about projects I worked on, I'm happy to talk about any of those things. I just want to see what Anne is sewing. Would you show it to us again?
Yeah. Well, I am working on a project where I use the context of the beautiful dead white girl, who is of course also cisgender and heterosexual. And it's a trope in American culture, for instance, where I don't think the lens of whiteness has been used early enough. So I use that to establish how some victims are privileged over others. And then I write about a specific case, a murder case, a homicide in 1965 in Indianapolis. Sylvia Marie Likens was a 16-year-old girl who was tortured to death. And there's so many narratives about her since 1965, like 9 books and 2 movies, and the most recent text was in 2018. So I talk about how she is, you know, made and then unmade, using Elaine Scarry's theory of unmaking and so on. And so in the 3rd section, I am creating a burial shroud for her and trying to offer an alternative way of telling stories of victims of femicide, and you know, from a place of caring and empathy instead. So the shroud is supposed to be an embrace, and then I'm trying to focus a lot on what Louise Bourgeois says about how sewing is a process of emotional repair. Because one of the things that was done to Sylvia Likens was that her torturers took a sewing needle and heated it up, and then they wrote on her stomach, "I'm a prostitute and proud of it." So they wrote, you know, a slut-shaming, victim-blaming narrative on her body. And so I'm trying to counter that by using the sewing needle as, you know, a tool for repairing instead of a tool of torture. So that's what I'm working on. Yeah.
Wow, yeah, that's powerful. Thanks for sharing.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I actually, I don't know, you just mentioned that you have ADHD.
Yeah.
And I was just diagnosed. So I was just wondering, I've been trying to find texts that talk about academics with ADHD and trying to, you know, put that into some sort of framework. So I'm just actually curious about how does your ADHD inform your methodology and, you know, just your working process, if it's okay with you to talk about that.
Sure. I mean, I mentioned it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I was diagnosed as a kid. And I guess since I do work about chronic illness or disability, it's reasonable to mention it. But I don't, yeah. So I think it definitely informs my work in terms of we're doing a lot of collaboration with people. I mean, now I'm at UC Santa Cruz. I have a studio lab where I work with grad students a lot for my work, and alums. And I think that is informed by having ADHD, you know, this like, it's much easier for me to have a conversation with people than to try to like sit and focus and organize a long schedule of things. I also have the kind of ADHD where I can hyper focus on computer screens. So look at me, I guess. It's like a problem with task switching, which ends up being kind of a benefit, I guess. I mean, I guess the way what I've done is to be a media artist with that. and yeah, look at screens a lot. I discovered when I was doing my qualifying exams for my PhD that I could read so much better on a Kindle than on paper, because it's a screen, or on an iPad than on paper. So that's how I did my exams. Yeah.
You're making it work with you instead of against you.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, some people use medication. I tried that for a while too. There's a lot of stuff on Twitter about ADHD that's really helpful. There's an ADHD alien. That's like my favorite comic that's on Twitter.
I follow that.
It's so good.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I think that was a really good place to end the talk.
Great.
And discussion. Yes, thank you all for coming, and I hope that you'll go and check out the game on the website LGBTQ, and yeah, go out and check also all the other talks. They are online as well, so you can go and see them. That we recorded them. And then I will say thank you for coming, and thanks for sharing all your really wonderful information and thoughts. I
Thank you
learned
so
something.
much for organizing and for inviting me. It was really an honor. It was really great to talk to you all.
Yes, and thank you, Micha.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was really nice, and I'm really happy that I got to hear this.
Okay. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.